Hello, friends, and welcome to Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly podcast designed to help mainstream Texans of faith understand the legislative process and to help you engage with public policy in the great state of Texas. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and this episode is part of our legislative wrap-up series. We're excited to welcome Kristin Etter, Director of Policy and Legal Services with the Texas Immigration Law Council. And y'all, I really tried to resist the urge to talk about all that's happening at the federal level, with some success. We did touch on it in the second half of the conversation, but the goal of this series is to be a resource for Texans of faith to understand what happened in the Texas legislative session and maybe use it as a tool to look back on as we move into election season next year. So we hope that you'll share this resource with your friends who might be interested. As always, if you are interested in working on these issues, Texas Impact has tools for you. Check out the Action Center at texasimpact.org for ways that you can get involved. And I will say that our issue champion teams did incredible work throughout the session, so I hope you'll consider joining one of those communities to connect with like-minded Texans of faith. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with Kristin Etter. Joining us for the conversation this week is friend of the program, frequent guest, one of my favorite humans, Kristin Etter, who is the Director of Policy and Legal Services with the Texas Immigration Law Council. Kristin, thanks so much for joining us again.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me, and it's a pleasure to reconnect with you all.
Love it. I think the last time we talked, we were maybe in the midst of legislative session and everybody was tired. Have you had a chance to catch up on rest since the session ended?
Yes. And we're very pleased to not see any special sessions that have been called. So hoping it's a wrap for...
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Exactly. I know. I'm like, please, no more.
I know you, I say that, I guess in the immigration space, it's certainly been a busy few weeks since the session ended. And we might talk about some of that later in the program, but we do want to stay focused for most of this episode on wrapping up the legislative session and talking about what happened so people can bank that information and start to prepare for conversations with legislators and candidates during the next part of this biennium. But before we jump into specifics, any general impressions on the legislative session this year?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the general impressions from our perspective, of course, we were most concerned about bills that targeted immigrants, bills that targeted nonprofits and organizations that worked with immigrants, and the broader impact on Texans and local communities across our state. And so, there were a lot of very bad bills that had been filed, a lot of very bad bills that we were tracking. And at the end of it all, some of the worst bills ended up dying. We did have a few that we were tracking that we were concerned about that did end up passing. But I would just say generally, it was not as bad as it could have been. Also, another thought is, in terms of how the Texas legislature has really kind of set the model for what we now see under the Trump administration as a mass deportation campaign. There's a real symbiotic relationship between our state and the Trump administration, and a lot of the officials that now work in Trump 2.0 had been really kind of shaping a lot of the policies and laws that we've seen over the last few years in our state, especially under Operation Lone Star. And so I think that given the fact that they're now both in state and federal power, we see kind of, again, things could have been a lot worse. And now we see Texas kind of hand off the baton to the federal government when it comes to mass deportation and criminalization of immigrants.
I love it when the glimmer of hope is it's not as bad as it could have been. That is certainly saying something. As we go throughout the series, talking about our other issue areas, there is usually a glimmer of hope that there was a good bill that we supported that passed. And so I want to start each episode talking about the good news there. Bobby Watson, and in his legislative wrap-up on Substack for Texas Impact, mentioned that this is maybe the one issue area where he couldn't think of a good bill that passed. Is Bobby missing anything? Any good bills that y'all supported that made it through?
Honestly, I just started panicking. Wait, what good bills were there? I have no idea. And I actually just felt a little bit of panic as you began to ask that question, because there's nothing good that I'm aware of.
Excellent. In terms of good bills passing, you did mention there were some bad ones that died, and we'll get to those. But in terms of bills that actually did pass, all bad, I think, in this issue space. And I want to start with Senate Bill 8, because that is one that Texas Impact and our membership cared a lot about. We talked a lot about in our Marching Orders Monday in this podcast. Talk to us about Senate Bill 8. What was it and what happened there?
Yeah, so Senate Bill 8 is the mandatory 287G agreements on local law enforcement across our state. And I'll step back and explain a little bit more. 287G agreements are partnerships with local law enforcement and the federal immigration enforcement wing of the federal government. And so we've had 287G around for quite some time. That has been a law on the federal books. And Texas law enforcement agencies have always, since the law was enacted, and I don't even remember what year it has been, but it's been more than a decade, they've always had the opportunity to opt into 287G agreements at differing levels. So there are 3 different levels. One is a jail enforcement model, where you're working in the jail to essentially put ICE detainers on immigrants that have already been put in jail for some other reason. The second is the warrant service officer model, which allows jailers and people that contract with jails in the jails to serve administrative ICE warrants on immigrants in their detention. And then the third is what we call a tactical or task force model. And that is agents in the street, state law enforcement agents in the street, stopping, arresting, detaining, interrogating people based on their immigration status. And so that is the one that that is of the 3, the one that is most aggressive and most concerning. And so essentially Senate Bill 8, it went through, it was filed a certain way, and then there was a House version that kind of watered it down, and then it went to conference committee. And what ended up coming out of that conference committee is a requirement that all law enforcement agents, I think that all communities that have a jail, so I think it's like 252 or 3 counties in Texas, have to adopt a version of the 287G agreement. And what that means is, again, if law enforcement had wanted to do this, they've been able to do this for years. And so Senate Bill 8 is a real slap in the face to local law enforcement officers across our state. And it's a way to basically divert local community policing and local priorities and take those priorities away and turn local law enforcement agents into immigration agents enforcing immigration law. And while there's no requirement that they engage in a specific model, the concern here is not only the way that the bill passes, not only does it say it has to enter into a 287G agreement, but there's also a provision that says, or a similar federal program. So what that really could end up being is, if the federal government tomorrow decides to get rid of the 2 kind of the least bad, which is jail enforcement and warrant service, and only have the task force model, or alternatively come up with their own program altogether, a different program than 287G. Well, guess what? Our local law enforcement officers are going to be forced to basically be submissive and do whatever the federal government tells them to do. And so that means that this new policy is limited only by the imagination of someone like Stephen Miller.
All right, so real talk time. I was on social media last night and started seeing a parents group that I was in freaking out about another piece of legislation that had passed that they were not aware of. There are a lot of people in Texas who have not been paying attention to the Texas Legislature. What kind of impact is this going to have on local communities?
Honestly, Scott, the number of ways that this could impact local communities are almost too immeasurable to talk during this particular podcast. So I will just say generally, what this does is it turns local law enforcement agents into federal immigration agents. So that means people are not going to call the police when there's been a crime. Victims are not going to come forward to report crimes. Witnesses will not be coming forward to help with prosecutors and law enforcement in prosecuting crimes. And not only that, but because there is really no additional resources other than like a very small amount of money per year to these counties, it is also not just that they're not going to have any type of trust or participation by immigrant communities when it comes to keeping their communities safe, but also it is going to divert the resources, both financial as well as manpower, like personnel costs. They are going to be diverted. So instead of out there going after violent criminals, out there going after drunk drivers, child predators, you name it, whatever the community safety issues are in those local communities, it does not matter. Those law enforcement officers will be diverted and told they have to go become immigration agents and go after people, regardless of whether they're criminals. So, they're really going to be targeting, again, this is really going to target non-criminals, especially if you see these more aggressive task force models that are going to be agents on the streets doing this type of enforcement. So it is such a concern that communities across our state are going to be less safe on so many different levels. It's going to impact families, schools, employees, businesses, employers. People aren't going to show up to work. I mean, I think kind of what we see at the federal level now and all of the issues happening with immigration raids and, agriculture and other industries that rely heavily on immigrant labor, losing workers, it's just going to be very intensified in our state, because you're going to take what we see at the federal level and it's going to be very concentrated in communities with these required 287G agreements. So sadly, it's going to make our state much less safe, much less prosperous. I think it has a real potential of making our economy, crash and potentially have very devastating impacts on our economy and just really on the well-being, safety, and security of our communities.
Kristin, that sounds bad. Spoiler, at the end of this episode, we're going to talk about things that people can do moving forward. But specifically on Senate Bill 8, I don't think that's a go talk to your legislator. Like right now, there's probably some local action that people need to be taking. What do you recommend that people do in the coming weeks and months?
Yes. So I recommend what we're doing is we're doing outreach with local law enforcement agencies across the state. I recommend that your listeners reach out to their local law enforcement officers and tell them that they understand that this is now going to be in effect as of December 1st. And that they want their local law enforcement agents to adopt the least bad version, which is the warrant service officer model. Because the other two result in, again, and let me just take a step back. The warrant service officer model allows people already in the jail that have ICE warrants. The local jailers can essentially serve the warrants on the people that are already in custody. But, there are two things about that. First of all, what we're seeing is some really concerning activity by state police officers working in tandem with federal immigration officers to conduct traffic stops. And so I want your listeners to know that traffic stops can lead to jail, to becoming jailed. Every single transportation code violation in Texas, with the exception of open container and no seatbelt, and speeding, and there are two. So it's open container and speeding. Those are the only two that are non-arrestable traffic code violations. Every other traffic code, the officer has the discretion to arrest the person and take them to jail for a ticket, for a Class C traffic ticket. That includes situations like failure to signal a lane change, running a red light, not having enough tire pressure in your tires, having your window tint be too dark, having something obstruct your rear view mirror, like something that you've hung on your rear view mirror. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of traffic code violations, and you can be pulled over, stopped, detained, and arrested for all of those. So I wanted to also kind of make this distinction that just because there's somebody that is in a jail under the warrant service model, under the 287G warrant service model, doesn't mean that they are what we would presume, to be like some type of violent or, public safety threat criminal.
Certainly a system that can be abused. Yeah,
exactly. A traffic code violation. And so we're hearing a lot of reports of places in Texas where they're essentially just pulling people over for very innocuous, like supposed traffic violations, taking them to jail, and ICE is picking them up. So, all versions of this are going to be really bad. And there's a way to essentially, as I've described, to work kind of in tandem with local law enforcement officers to do these traffic code violation stops to then get them into the immigration deportation pipeline. But the warrant service officer model is the least bad of the three. So I would really encourage your listeners to talk to law enforcement and say, we want our law enforcement officers out protecting us and keeping us safe. We don't want them out focusing all of their attention and limited resources on non-criminals in our community.
I appreciate that. That's helpful and some good advice for steps that people can take moving forward. I did want to make sure we spend a few minutes on Senate Bill 8 because that was the big bad bill. But other bad bills that passed this time that were on y'all's radar that we should be paying attention to?
So, we are obviously concerned about Senate Bill 17, which is the bill that limits land acquisition and, real estate purchases by quote unquote foreign adversaries as just unfortunately a step towards kind of the buildup of what we saw before we saw Japanese internment camps here in our state. So we were really concerned about that one. And, some of the other, we can talk about, there was so much that did not pass that I would say Senate Bill 8 and Senate Bill 17, from our perspectives, were really kind of the worst ones when it comes to immigration and targeting immigrants.
So certainly some bad news on that front, but there were also a lot of really bad ones that did not make it over the finish line. And you've mentioned a couple of those already, but what kind of led the way on those for you?
Yeah, so I would say there was a real push this legislative session to not just further criminalize immigrants and further, kind of criminalize the whole operation in kind of having local law enforcement work hand in hand with the Trump administration on a mass deportation campaign. But also there was a real push to try to defund organizations and also make it easier for the Attorney General to investigate organizations that help immigrants in our state. So House Bill 1554 would have prohibited cities from providing financial assistance for immigrants in legal proceedings. That one died. We were really happy to hear because we spent a lot of time working with law school clinics across our state that staff these types of programs. And that would have been, this bill would have essentially shuttered those types of programs. And those are the programs that we need in our state to actually help immigrants do it the right way. So the people that are helped by these kinds of services that HB 1554 would have taken away are the very services that we hear over and over about, trying to make sure that people are doing it the right way. And that's exactly what those kind of dollars do in terms of helping immigrants get work authorization, helping immigrants get all of their legal documentation in order. Because as your listeners may or may not know, you have no right to an attorney in immigration proceedings, unlike criminal proceedings where you will be guaranteed a court-appointed lawyer for any crime above a Class C ticket in our state. Immigration proceedings, you're not entitled to a lawyer. And so most people handle the legal system in the civil immigration context on their own, and that includes children. And so having the services to help people, again, get their legal documentation in order, get their work authorization helps everybody, not just immigrants. It helps people, not have to live in the shadows and be able to be, full participants in our communities and go to school, get jobs. It helps our local economies and our local businesses by providing, lawful workers. And really, those are the people that generate, our economic, that generate our economy in Texas and are, we're going to miss it when it's gone, is what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Like if we start to see some of these bills, I think they're clearly designed to cause people to self-deport or leave Texas. And I think I don't know how long it's going to take, but there is going to be at some point a reckoning, and people are going to wish this era never happened. And it's going to be hard to kind of revitalize our state once immigrants are gone.
Yeah, and you saw a bunch of bills related to things like restricting access to healthcare, restricting access to education, which we'll talk about in a minute with the Texas Dream Act and what happened with that after the legislative session. Anything else that y'all were monitoring that didn't make it over the finish line?
Yes, we were monitoring quite a few state attorney general expansion bills. Um, and we were monitoring those because, as your listeners might know, our state attorney general has spent the last several years targeting organizations that work with immigrants with harassing civil litigation and baseless criminal accusations. And specifically, there have been 10 organizations since 2022 that work with immigrants in our state that have been targeted by our state attorney general. However, in our state, current law prohibits the state attorney general from having independent prosecutorial authority. What that means is that they, unless they're invited by the local prosecuting authority, are not able to actually file a criminal complaint against an individual. They have to be invited first. And so some of the bills that we were tracking would have essentially expanded their independent prosecutorial authority. And for example, one of them would have allowed the attorney general to turn what is a civil kind of investigative request under the Business Organizations Code that was used to target the Annunciation House. House Bill 4852 would have actually had a new crime created for not responding perfectly or quickly enough to one of these civil investigative demands by the attorney general. So that was one we were really concerned about, especially as we see the attorney general's office kind of engage in these very kind of what appear to be very politicized investigations against organizations that they don't agree with. And so there were several other bills that would have expanded AG power. None of those none of those passed. Those all died, thankfully. So we were tracking those quite a bit, and we're really concerned, especially as we see kind of these larger attacks on organizations and nonprofit organizations that work with immigrants. And also, that really also would include faith-based organizations, churches. And I know a lot of your listeners, I've worked a lot with faith-based organizations over the last couple of years that are very concerned about attacks on religious freedoms. And some of these bills would have essentially criminalized providing services to immigrants. So glad to see that those did not pass.
Yeah, I like that you put a good spin at the end of that. I am also glad that those did not pass. But I don't want listeners to feel super optimistic that those bills failed this time, because ideas keep coming back. And I think we're seeing some of these things that failed in the Texas legislature now playing out at the federal level. And the way legislation works, if a bill started to move this time and didn't get over the finish line, spoiler, somebody's going to bring that back next legislative session and try again. And so I love that we can celebrate these bills dying in the Texas legislature this time. But the ones we're talking about dying are probably the ones we also need to be having conversations with our legislators about to make sure that they do not move forward next time as well, because somebody seems to think these are a good idea, right?
Yes, Scott, that is a great point. And not only is it very important to have these kind of crucial moments in the interim year before the next session, but also we can also kind of anticipate that there was this real push to have these kind of criminalized investigations on nonprofits in our state. And because we know that our state works so closely with the Trump administration, and in fact, many of the employees at the Texas Attorney General's office now work in the Trump administration. So, the concern here is, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think Texas has kind of handed the baton off to the federal government. And so the concern is, even though some of those laws did not pass, the federal government has much more authority to open criminal investigations under the Department of Justice. And much more kind of investigatory power than our state attorney general. So the concern also, and something I think listeners need to keep their eyes open for, is that these types of attacks become federalized. And we actually saw this just last week with an announcement by the Department of Homeland Security Oversight Committee has issued 215 letters from two members of that particular committee against 215 nonprofit organizations across the state. I believe about 17 or 18 are in Texas. but really just accusing them of very similar accusations that we have seen our attorney general make against nonprofits over the last couple of years. But they have opened up investigations into those organizations. So I think that's a perfect example of what you're talking about. They didn't get the law passed, pass the baton to, certain members of Congress who are now kind of taking that baton and running with it.
Yeah, I recognize my social media is not like many other people's, but I probably saw 50 people share the United Methodist News Service story about that congressional hearing. So it is certainly gaining some traction in religious world. Anything else that any other bad bills that you want to highlight that didn't make it across the finish line?
Well, I think that this might be a good segue to talk about Senate Bill 1798 and all of the other kind of attacks on our education system here in Texas. So we saw multiple bills filed that would have challenged Plyler v. Doe, which is the K through 12 education that allows, all children, regardless of immigration status, to have free K through 12 education. Thankfully, those all died.
Not a Governor Bush era set of legislation, or am I misremembering that?
That I can't remember the year of that. No,
anyway,
it predated that. But yes, we saw several bills that would have attacked K through 12 that did not. Those bills really went nowhere. Thankfully, we were really worried about those bills kind of gaining some traction this session. But what did gain traction and what did go further than most people thought these bills would go is the DREAM Act repeal bills. So specifically Senate Bill 1798, which would have repealed the Texas DREAM Act, which provides in-state tuition for qualifying undocumented students in Texas that have graduated from high school and have a residence here in Texas. So there was a House version and the Senate version, and they, went to hearings and they got much further. But there was not the political will to repeal our DREAM Act, which we've had in place since 2001, and which has been a real kind of gem in our state's education approach. Because, I don't even have the numbers off the top of my head, but providing in-state tuition to undocumented children has generated billions of dollars to our Texas economy. And those students go on to have extraordinary careers and give back so much to our state, not just economically, but they become teachers and lawyers and doctors and nurses. And, the fact that our legislature would go after that and try to repeal something that has worked so well for 24 years was really astounding, the fact that it made it so far. And, it did not pass because there was such a large coalition of people in the business community, faith-based community, and of course, the students themselves and educators and people that work in higher ed. And I attended both hearings in the House and the Senate. We were there till 1 a.m. The rooms were packed. There was so much opposition, and the will of the people prevailed. There was not political will to repeal the DREAM Act with good reason. And then, we saw what happened after that, which is another, again,
minutes after the session ended.
Right. The session ended. The Department of Justice, Pam Bondi, filed a lawsuit against Texas, alleging that the DREAM Act violated federal law. And within 6 hours from that lawsuit, they picked the one particular judge in North Texas that is known for, siding with the Trump administration and is a conservative judge. So they filed it in, they did forum shopping, filed it in that jurisdiction, got that particular judge. And within 6 hours of the filing of the lawsuit, our attorney, our state settled the case. And then we got a consent judgment that essentially did away with the DREAM Act in this particular order. And so within 6 hours, even though, again, since 2001, Texas and the people of Texas have said over and over and over that we want to have this in place. We want to have an educated workforce. We want to have people that want to stay in our state and become educated and give back to their communities and help our economies grow and open up new businesses and become teachers and doctors and lawyers and engineers. We want that. And within 6 hours, the collusion between our state attorney general and our state government and the federal government did away with that. It is one of the most shameful and potentially, I don't know, there's been a lawsuit filed by MALDEF since then. So we'll see where it ends up, kind of falling. But I don't know. I just don't even have the correct words to say on a faith-based podcast about how shameful and outrageous that maneuver was.
And to be clear, the state of Texas is not making a habit of settling with the Department of Justice when they sue us to try to back down from something the legislature has decided, right?
No, I mean, that was just part of the most enraging aspect of this. Is this also happened at a time where the federal government is seeking to abolish the Department of Education. And this is also at a time where our state has said over and over and over that we want to control our own state. We want to control our own education. We want to control our own law enforcement. We want state control. We don't want the federal government imposing their will on us. Think about all the "don't tread on me" messages and flags. And, this is literally turning that on its head. And the fact that we would essentially allow the federal government to dictate what our state's approach to education should be, especially after we know the voters and the people that represent us in our state did not want this and could have chosen to do this, but did not. And the fact that they're able to collude with the federal government in this way is, like I said, not just shameful, but just the height of hypocrisy and really just detestable and repulsive. I don't even know. I mean, again, I kind of am at a loss of words when it comes to this particular subject matter because it was just such a dirty move on the part of our state.
Don't love that. Also, don't love a lot of other things that are happening around the country. And we could do a whole nother episode about everything that's happening in DC and throughout the country. But just in terms of this legislative wrap-up series, again, we're recording the third week of June. What should we be watching for over the coming weeks and months?
Yeah. So, what we're monitoring very closely is just the escalating tactics that are being used in the mass deportation campaign. We've been watching, in horror as the rest of the country, sees what mass deportation looks like. And that looks like, going after hardworking people that have been here for decades. That means de-documenting hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people that did it the right way, that came in with permission, that entered through ports of entry, again, that did it the right way, that now find themselves de-documented, almost 1 million people now on top of, the initial kind of population of people that were subject to a mass deportation campaign, just continuing to add on to those numbers by taking away protections at the federal level. And really, again, I think it's all just going to be this, the 3,000 people a day quota that was set by Stephen Miller a couple weeks ago means that would be 1 million people a year. And so when you're trying to deport 1 million people a year, again, we know they're not going after criminals. We know they're going after people that did it the right way. And those are people that are your family members, that are your community members, that work in your local businesses. And we're really concerned about the escalating tactics of having masked armed men show up in courts, show up at schools, show up at people's houses, show up at churches, and whisk people away with no due process. And, one of the things that I am concerned about as a Texan is the way that Operation Lone Star operated in our state, which is, again, our state. We are both fortunate and unfortunate to have a 4-year head start on the rest of the country because Operation Lone Star, which started in 2021, was a state program policy initiative to declare a disaster in our state because of immigration. That has had to be repeated every 30 days. Our governor signs a new disaster declaration every 30 days. And that allows this very expansive executive power grab to initiate what he did in Operation Lone Star along the border and criminalize immigrants, and create this giant sham of a system to prosecute immigrants. And those same people that have been stationed on the border have left the border because the federal government has now kind of seized control of that area, and replaced state law enforcement. And so those people are now in our own communities. And the concern is that the tactics that had been used against immigrants under Operation Lone Star in our state are now being used against us. And so I think we see that when we look at, some of the Texas National Guard being deployed in advance of some of the protests that were happening recently for the No King's Day. We see it at the federal level with the military going to places like LA and other, Democratic cities and states. And so really what we're watching is, unfortunately, just going to be how they continue to weaponize the government and to dilute constitutional protections for not just immigrants, but for everybody. Because again, we see them kind of test out things, and we see the lack of due process, of course, with like the deportations that we saw happen to El Salvador and to other places. And we know how it's done in Texas. And again, watch what happened in Texas, and then we can see it happen again. We have the 4-year head start. So those same tactics will then be used against us. So, really concerned about where that leaves us as, people that cherish our Constitution and cherish the freedoms that we had under our Constitution, and really watching those freedoms be whittled away under the guise of a mass deportation campaign.
Yeah, and people who cherish our neighbors and people who we live in and around and worship with and work with and do all of those things. So certainly work that needs to be done. You've talked about steps we can take at the local level. I think for a lot of this episode, our what do we do next will be focused on conversations we should be having with our Texas elected representatives. But for you, I feel like I'll let you open that up to members of Congress as well. What do you hope people will be doing over the coming weeks? What do you hope people will be talking to their elected representatives about?
Yeah, so this is a time where everybody should be engaged at some level, because one of the worst things that can happen is that people become so demoralized by what they see and so appalled that they turn away and just can't deal and want to check out. This is a very kind of existential moment for the history of our country. And this is a time that people should, again, at whatever level you feel comfortable with, whether that be meeting with your city council, meeting with your state officials, reaching out to members of Congress, forming kind of broad coalitions. So there's a really great historian that I have read a lot of, I think all of his books, but Timothy Snyder, he wrote one of his most famous books was called On Tyranny. And he studies authoritarians throughout history and has said that the only way that authoritarian regimes have been defeated throughout history is when you have a broad coalition of people that come together that might not agree on many, if not most things, but can share agreement on one thing. And I think that that's kind of where we're at right now. So I work with a lot of, we're a nonpartisan organization. I work with a lot of people that are conservative, a lot of people that are, progressive. And having experienced the last few months, I feel like this is probably the best moment in time that we have to form these broad coalitions with folks that we might not have agreed with on most things. And I say that because I have been approached by so many people that were Trump supporters that voted for President Trump that say to me, I did not want this. We thought he was only going to be going after criminals. I did not want to see, members of my family that have been here for decades that have never committed a crime. I did not want to see those people rounded up and thrown into foreign prisons with no due process. I did not want to see longtime community members that have been here be whisked away by armed men. I did not want to see the refugee family that I sponsored be told that they have to go back to their country within 7 days. I did not want to see Afghani, refugees that worked for the U.S. military being told they have to go back to Afghanistan. And so it's really about kind of forming these broad coalitions, not just politically, but within your community to say, nobody saw, whatever your political beliefs are, I think most people can agree on most things that we did not want this. And so really kind of forming those coalitions, reaching out. I know that there are so many, I live in Austin, lots of different coalitions that have sprung up as a result of kind of what, people have been experiencing these last few years. So I would say, join the coalitions, use your church and your faith-based institutions as a place to have conversations, as a place to really kind of, again, have the support, whether it be forming a group to go talk to your congressman or to go talk to your making appointments, especially during the interim. I know a lot of people will call their representatives during the legislative year, but here in Texas, they're still your legislator. Go and set up meetings, bring in your coalition, whether it be your business or your church or your, whatever group it is, and spend a lot of time talking to people and don't ignore what's happening.
I think you're right. The message is we did not want this, right? And it's important for faith communities to say that we did not want the Texas Dream Act to be repealed. Our legislature said no. Our legislature has historically supported that piece of legislation and ideas like that. I do not think our congregations want people being ripped away from schools, from immigration hearings, from churches, from all of those different places. So it's important that we communicate that and do it as a church, right? With our faith hats on, to let our elected representatives know we did not want this. We did not sign up for this. I think that's a good word to start to close out this episode. Any closing thoughts or shameless plugs you want to leave us with today?
I was going to mention that we've been doing a lot with just kind of education, resource, and materials about knowing your rights if you do decide to be in public observing and recording immigration and law enforcement activities. So I wanted to kind of put a plug out there for that, those sharing of those resources, just very basic kind of how to keep yourself safe, how to make sure that, your observations and recordings, that they don't interfere with any kind of law enforcement activities, but really how important it is to get as many kind of stories. And like you said, Scott, using your faith-based hat, because that is very powerful. Faith-based people in our state have a superpower, and that is because we live in a state that has at least said religious freedom and religious protections are at its core. And so, your voice likely means a lot more to some of these lawmakers in our state and also at the federal level. And, happy to see that there's a new pope that, is the first American pope, and he seems really awesome. Today is National Refugee Day. And I know that there was going to be a lot of clergy that had been organizing to support immigrants in, check-ins and court appearances. So really happy to see the faith-based communities support immigrants and support their neighbors and make your voice heard. And like I said, don't turn away, don't ignore, be engaged. We also have a monthly newsletter that has a lot of other opportunities, volunteer opportunities. We have a court watch program that we offer free training if your listeners want to engage in court watch. We're also doing a pro bono habeas program. And, we just have a lot of different opportunities if your listeners are interested that I'll go ahead and share maybe with your listeners the links if they want to sign up for the newsletters or sign up for any of our trainings or receive any of the materials that we put out, obviously at no cost. And just really, again, I mean, so pleased that you all have this voice and that this is now the time to use it.
Love that. Kristin, thank you so much. Listeners, check out the show notes for links that Kristin's talking about. Kristin, really appreciate your work each and every day, but especially today for joining us. Thanks for all you do.
Thank you all so much.
I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with Kristin. What an incredible advocate and partner. And I hope you'll check out her podcast and all of the resources that she named. We'll be listing those in the show notes. And as we focus on the session wrap-up, I want to once again plug the Texas Impact issue teams. Take a moment to check out the Action Center page at texasimpact.org and consider joining one of the teams. If you're already a member, I hope you'll encourage your friends to sign up, so consider how you can promote the opportunities to get involved. And again, I want to thank y'all for listening to this podcast throughout the legislative session, and I look forward to our future programming. If you have ideas or suggestions, please share them. My email is scott@texasimpact.org. While you're on the website checking out the issue champion teams, I hope that you'll also take a moment to sign up to be a member of Texas Impact. Your membership supports this podcast and all of the work to engage Texans of faith to advocate for a more just and equitable Texas. So with that, I think it's time we close out this episode. So remember, the world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Etter, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.